Hello everyone, this is Mr. Young and welcome to Human Anatomy and Physiology. Today's podcast will be the first podcast in Unit 1, which we will talk about the introduction to this class. The first thing that we're going to discuss is the difference between anatomy and physiology. So when we go through this class, we're really going to be looking at kind of two separate things, even though they are very similar and they're going to kind of really complement each other. So the anatomy portion of this class is going to deal with the structures of the human body. So we're talking about anything that we would be able to identify. So for example, let's say we're looking at the bones of the body, and our upper leg bone we would identify as the femur. That would be an example of the study of anatomy. We are pinpointing and identifying a certain part of the human body. The physiology portion of the class is going to deal with how those body parts will function. Sometimes the physiology part's a little bit more complicated than just dealing with one body part. A lot of times you're going to have many different body parts that will need to be working together in order to produce one specific function. So an example of this is, let's say when we're studying the heart. One of the things that we'll do when we're studying the heart is we're going to look at all of the different structures of the heart, the different chambers of the heart, the different parts that make up the whole structure of the heart. We will identify all those, which will be the anatomy piece, but we're also going to be concerned with how each of those parts will work. And ultimately, we know that the heart is going to be able to pump blood throughout the body, but it's a very complicated mechanism when you deal with all the specific parts. So that'll be the physiology portion. One thing that you guys will need to understand about this class is that when we test, there's really going to be two different kinds of tests. Well, for the most part, in every unit, we will have at least one or several identification tests. And these identification tests will be specifically on the anatomy portion. So you will be given a diagram, whether it's going to be in a book or a handout or on a website, and you will have to study it. And you will get that exact same diagram in some way, and you'll have to identify all the parts that are listed. The second part is going to be the physiology, and this is kind of the harder of the two. The anatomy portion, if you're good at memorizing, you guys will do very well on that part of the test, or on that kind of test. The physiology part's a little bit more difficult because now we're dealing with how all these parts work. So a lot of the lecture stuff that you will listen to and that I will be presenting in class will be on those sorts of tests. The next thing that I want to mention is, as we're going through each of these lectures, I think it's very important that you take out your textbook and you follow along. There's great diagrams and some great information that are found in our textbook, and I'll be making references to each, to these as I move through the lecture. So the first thing that I want to show you is, if you turn to page 4 in your textbook, I want you to look at figure 1.3, and this is showing you what is called the levels of organization of the human body. Now, we're not really going to deal in this class with the first 5 or 6 of them, the atom, the molecule, and so on up to the cell. That's more of a biological or a biology topic. So we spend more time in biology discussing those particular things. Where we'll start in this class is we're going to start with the tissue and move up to the organism. So if you can see the diagram of the tissue, in chapter 5, we're going to be talking about all the different types of tissues that are found in the human body. And then when we have a group of tissues that are working together, that will in fact be known as an organ. So I mentioned a couple of organs already in this lecture. I talked about the femur, which is a bone, which would be an organ, and that bone is going to be made up of many different kinds of tissues. The heart, same thing. The heart's made up of many different kinds of tissues, and the heart, of course, would be an organ as well. Then when you take many organs and put them together, you will get what's called an organ system. So if you take all of the bones of the human body and you just study those in one grouping, now you are dealing with an organ system that we call the skeletal system. The heart is going to be complementary to the blood vessels that are found in the human body and the lungs, and that makes up what we call the cardiovascular system, which is another organ system. And then when you take all of the organ systems together, and in this book they cover 11 different organ systems. We won't get through all of them, but we're going to get through most of them, and we'll make some references to each one of them in some degree as we go through this class. All those organ systems collectively make up the organism. So that's a little bit about the levels of organization that occur in the human body. The next topic that I would like to discuss is a little bit on the characteristics of life, or simply what would make a human being be characterized as being alive. One thing that I definitely want you to look at on page 5 is table 1-1, labeled the characteristics of life. And there they show you a lot of different things that would be considered, that we would have to consider in order for an organism to be alive. They're pretty self-explanatory, movement, the change in body position, and so on. I'm not going to read all of this to you. You can definitely take your time and go through this table, but there is a couple that I want you to, that I think I need to explain. Mainly, if you go to the second to the last one, called assimilation. That's maybe a term that you maybe haven't heard of before, but what we mean by assimilation is this is when we're going to take a substance that has been absorbed by our body, and we're going to be able to change it into something that would be chemically different. So this would be an example of what would happen in our digestive system. So when we take food and we eat it, we break it down, we swallow, it gets into our stomach, and we start this whole chemical digestion part. And as the food moves from our stomach and into our intestine, these are places where this assimilation will take place, where we're taking the parts that make up the foods that we eat and we're changing them into chemically different substances, which are going to be very important for us, and very important for organisms to be able to live. So all of those characteristics of life are very important, and as I said, most of them are pretty self-explanatory. If you have any questions, make sure you ask me in class if you don't understand any of them. Collectively, what happens with the characteristics of life is then we deal with a topic called metabolism. So what metabolism is all about is, if we define it, metabolism is what we call the sum of all chemical reactions that are going to occur in the body. And those chemical reactions are going to do a couple of things. They're either going to break things down or they're going to build things up. So when we take that concept of metabolism and all these different reactions that will occur, we need to make sure that we understand how they will tie in with the characteristics of life. So all of those things listed in table 1-1, they will all have to work in order for metabolism to be able to occur in the human body. Now, the next thing that I want to move to is to discuss a little bit about the maintenance of life. And, if I were to ask you a question of what are some of the things that organisms need in order to live, I'm sure you would come up with most of them that are listed on page 5 in your book. You can see things like water and food and oxygen, which would be what I think all of you would be able to come up with. For sure. There's a couple on the list that maybe you would have had a little bit more difficulty in, those being heat and pressure. But these are all going to be very, very important in order for organisms to be able to maintain life. I think we all understand why we need water. It isn't just simply because we're going to be thirsty and we need to have it, but water is going to be very, very important for this metabolism concept that we just referred to before. All chemical reactions, or at least most chemical reactions, are going to happen in a water type of environment. Also, water is going to be a substance that will be able to transport materials throughout the body. And water is also going to be extremely important for regulating body temperature. The food part is pretty easy because food is going to give us energy. That's one thing that it does. And the other thing is the foods that we eat are going to contain nutrients that are going to help us build things up or break things down. So that's very, very important for the metabolism process as well. Oxygen, pretty simple. Oxygen is mainly going to be used to drive all of the different metabolic processes that we have inside our body. The heat portion is it shows up being a requirement because it is going to be a product of the chemical reactions that are occurring. So when you have all these different reactions that are happening inside the human body, heat is going to be produced, but heat is going to be very, very important. So when all these chemical reactions are happening inside of our body, it's going to help us maintain that stable internal condition of body temperature that we have, which of course is 98.6 degrees. So when our body temperature is at 98.6 degrees, that means for the most part that everything's working pretty well inside our body as far as all the chemical reactions, and we're producing the proper amount of heat, which of course is going to, which of course we kind of talk about in terms of temperature, because temperature is the measure of the degree of heat that's going to be produced by the body. The last one, pressure, pressure is defined as the application of force to something. So when we deal with pressure, there's kind of two things that we'll look at in reference to the human body. One is atmospheric pressure, the pressure of the air that's going to be exerted on us. And the main thing that we deal with in this regard is in breathing. That's going to be very important for us to maintain our breathing. Another type of pressure is called hydrostatic pressure. Now, usually hydrostatic pressure is dealing with organisms that live underwater, that water pressure. So any kind of an aquatic species would have to undergo that. But we do have hydrostatic pressure as well when we are dealing with the human body. So for instance, when the heart is going to pump blood through the blood vessels, that's going to put a pressure, which of course we know as blood pressure. That is a hydrostatic pressure, and that forces the blood through all the vessels and of course throughout the rest of the body. One thing I want you guys to look at on page 5, and we'll make a lot of references to these throughout this class. There's the little orange box on the right-hand side. This is dealing with a concept called vital signs and why vital signs are important. I think we all know a little bit about vital signs. We've all been to the doctor, and we know, when you get into the doctor's office, the nurse comes in and they take a bunch of different vital signs. So I want you to kind of read through that just to refresh your memory a little bit in that regard. The last thing that I want to mention in this podcast, in this lecture, is going to be on what we refer to as homeostasis. And homeostasis is going to pop up a lot. Almost in every unit that we cover, we will make some references to homeostasis. Simply what this means is homeostasis is dealing with maintaining a stable internal environment. So we have all of what we call set points inside of our body. We have different levels of things that we need to have exactly or very close to these levels in order for us to feel good. But what can happen sometimes is things can happen in our body where these conditions can deviate from the set point. But what we do is we have mechanisms that are set in place that we're able to get back, hopefully, to those set points. So what we're going to talk about is going to be something we call feedback mechanisms, and we have two different types of feedback mechanisms. The first one that I want to cover is one called a negative feedback mechanism. So I want you to turn to page 6 and 7 in your textbook, because there's some good diagrams that will